Hello, everybody. I think we're ready to start with this session. So it's a great honor for me to introduce my mentor and friend, Professor Kia Nobre, as this year's recipient of the Fred Kavli Distinguished Career Contributions Award. Now, before we hand her the award, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to say a few words about her academic trajectory and contributions. So Kia was born and raised in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And after secondary school, she moved to the United States, where she obtained her Ph.D. at Yale University in 1993, working with Gregory McCarthy. She then spent a stint at Harvard Medical School, working with Marcel Mesulam, until moving to the University of Oxford, where she founded the Brain and Cognition Laboratory, and where she spent almost 30 years, occupying various posts, including head of the Department of the Experimental Psychology Department and director of the Oxford Center for Human Brain Activity. Now, last year, Kia moved back to her alma mater, where she currently leads the brand new Center for Neurocognition and Behavior at the Woodside Institute at Yale University in New Haven. To date, Kia's family, because she considers the members and past members of her lab a family, counts close to 100 graduate students and postdocs. Over the years, Kia has accumulated an impressive number of recognitions. She's an elected member of the British Academy and of the National Academy of Sciences, and she has received many prizes, including the Heineke Prize for Cognitive Science and the Lifetime Mentor Award from the Association for Psychological Sciences. But I think if we were to ask her, is this award from the Cognitive Neuroscience Society that she's going to be particularly proud of? This is really homecoming for her. I think this is really her society. Now, when Kia asked me to introduce her, my initial reaction was something like, well, wouldn't it be more conventional for somebody more senior to introduce you? To which she responded, well, conventions are only there to be broken. And I think it's this attitude that really also characterizes her contributions to the field. Kia thinks outside the box, and she sees beyond existing borders. Time by time again, she has managed to open new fields of inquiry that have started by breaking conventions at first, but have ended up as very popular fields of research in cognitive neuroscience because they made sense. Kia's work has made clear how attention is a central force that interacts with other faculties of mind, including not only language, or not only perception, but also language, memory, and action. She has pioneered the studies of temporal attention, of attention in working memory, and of the long-term memory guidance of attention. She has made key insights into the neural basis of attention and memory in these various forms using a dazzling array of methods, including PET, fMRI, intracranial EEG, MEG, TMS, eye tracking, virtual reality. I think you get the idea. So I personally had the privilege of writing several review articles with Kia, and in this process, I noticed a recurring theme that I've come to think of as another central contribution, that of embracing the complexity and plurality of cognitive functions, rather than oversimplifying things by looking for the single mechanism, the single consequence, or the single theory that can explain it all. Now, I think her drive to seek out how things truly work also underpins Kia's long-standing advocacy for studying the brain in the fourth dimension of time. The brain is a dynamic organ that resides in a dynamic agent who lives in a dynamic world. And surely it's going to be complex to understand all these dynamics. But fortunately, we have people like Kia who are brave enough to take that torch and lead all of us the way. So Kia has a truly impressive stamina for the scientific endeavor and everything that comes with it. This includes not only publishing a staggering number of articles, book chapters, and books, and continuously finding new ways to track the dynamics of mind, but also serving the wider community, taking place in countless committees and serving as editor in key journals in our field, including previously at the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience and currently as senior editor at the Journal of Neuroscience. Kia is humble, and she's generous, and she cares deeply about the members in our lab. And I think I can speak on behalf of the wider brain and cognition family. I'm looking a little bit here, where everybody's sitting. That it's really hard to imagine a better mentor than Kia. And so it goes without saying that Kia is a role model for so many of us. And it's not only because of being a woman or having roots outside the West, but because of the person she is. The way she brings out the best in the people around her, and the way she kind of instills energy and confidence in you when having the pleasure of interacting with her. And so it's fantastic that all of this is now recognized by this Cognitive Neuroscience Society Award. And of course, while during an award like this, we look back at past achievements, I'm 100% certain that Kia herself will continue to look forward and continue to lead the field for many years to come. So please help me congratulate Kia on this award. Now, is the microphone on? Before we hand Kia the floor,
what are you going to do now?
So this is a retrieval cue, so that Kia never never forgets this moment. But we thought it's not that salient as a retrieval cue. So I think the lab has something that's slightly more salient to give to you, and so you will really never forget this moment. Okay.
For our captain.
Yay! Wow. Amazing. Forgive me if I don't wear this, but I tried to look a little pretty for the awards. This is very pretty, by the way. Wow. Thanks, Freek. That was too much, and it really touched my heart. Thank you very much. Okay. Hopefully my talk will show up. Yes. So, as you can tell, this is a really special moment for me. To be recognized in this way is beyond humbling. Those of you who have heard me speak before, you know that I love to cram in loads of data and to try to show you every which way in which we've cracked into a specific problem so that I can give you, the audience, confidence in our discoveries and how we've gone about doing our work. But today, that approach didn't seem quite right for me. I wanted to give a different kind of talk. I chose instead to try to share with you some of my trajectory of thinking and what I've distilled from our discoveries and others' discoveries over these happy decades of puzzling over the human mind. Trying to pick out the essence of what I've learned, acknowledging some points of tension, some puzzlements, some points of interesting directions for new travel. And as I go along, I hope to exude my sense of joy in this discovery and adventure process. I also want to highlight the importance of sharing scientific ideas, values, perspectives with others for our own growth, but also for the science itself. So I should warn you that I'm not going to be going into any details today. I will probably show some experimental designs and some results, but mainly as a reassuring backdrop, at least for me, my safety blanket, but without elaborating. Hopefully this won't prove frustrating for anyone, but if it does, please just come and talk to me about all of the nitty-gritty. I have been a scientist for as long as I remember. This is probably the age of my first memories, and I would say that curiosity and inquisitiveness are sort of my driving life force. And as a kid, I wondered, why is the sky blue, and why is water soft and hard and in the clouds? And discovering snow as a 4-year-old when we moved from Rio to New York for a while, I puzzled over how snowflakes could take infinite and unique, beautiful shapes. Then, over time, I was drawn to studying the mind. The mind, of course, because it is the most mysterious and wonderful entity in the known universe. But for me, also for some personal reasons. My younger brother was born in New York at that time, and because of a medical error, he became severely brain damaged. And as I interacted with him, I couldn't help but wonder what his mental life was like as I tried to connect with him. So being a cognitive neuroscience, or ending up as a cognitive neuroscience, is really a defining part of my identity. I've poured lots of love, sweat, and occasional tears over my research. So the most important thing for me to say really today is thank you. I know that I'm not the only person deserving of this award, and in my own trajectory, I see myself as a confluence of my mentors, my supervisors, my collaborators and friends, and my mentees, trainees, and students in an ever-changing river of exploration and discovery. My scientific values have matured over these years. They were deeply influenced by my supervisor, Greg McCarthy, and his methodological innovation, but also meticulousness, and by my mentor, Marcel Messelem, and his scholarship and his intellectual independence, and many, many kindred spirits along the way, collaborators research fellows, students who share that thrill of looking at big problems, new problems, old problems anew, and asking questions in various ways without fear of failing or being wrong, but more excited about the discovery. So I also know that this river of ours runs alongside many other rivers which also are carving really new, exciting, and deserving trajectories through our landscape. And without wishing to diminish anything from any of these people, today I would like to dedicate this talk to one kindred spirit, Mark Stokes, whose life and scientific contributions ended prematurely and too soon. So my approach to understanding the human mind is experimental. I love designing new experimental frameworks, playing with methods to ask new questions or big old questions in new ways that get at the fundamental properties of cognition. I like to strike a balance between being grounded in the classic ideas, knowing the ongoing literature and research, but trying to remain free from any sort of scientific fashions and arguments that sometimes can push us in sort of corners in our field. My aim is really to try to get at some of the principles of organization of cognition, and I've been less interested in developing theories or computational or theoretical models. I feel that our science, or at least my understanding, my scientific understanding, is still too immature for big theories or models. I've often interpreted my research as being a bit on the fringe, asking questions that don't quite fit in any scientific cognitive domain or core subdiscipline in the field. And I admit that did feel kind of scary at times. So through the core of this talk, I'm going to try to convey my sense of learning and some of the scientific transformations in 6 very short vignettes, which kind of capture some of the trends of thinking and some of the lessons that I've been learning along the way. So let's start with methods. There is nothing that expresses better the dynamism of cognitive neuroscience than the marvelous and relentless advances in our methods and analytical tools. When I chose to pursue a Ph.D. in human neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience, I did this against the advice of all my college professors at that time who tried to convince me that there was no useful way of studying the healthy human mind scientifically. Of course, they were wrong, and I stepped into the field as it was about to undergo a profound transformation. I was so lucky that I ended up in a tribe of intrepid pioneers at the neuropsychology lab at Yale in the mid-1980s. Truett Allison, in black and white here, was a senior figure, and he came from a pioneering lineage where his supervisor actually was one of the people who developed ways of turning continuous EEG into averages so we could start studying information processing. And Greg McCarthy, my supervisor, he really combined the best of experimental psychology with an appetite for methodological innovation and rigor. And those days, I became part of really an inspiring community of pioneer scientists working at the cutting edge of neurophysiology, human neurophysiology, mainly using event-related potentials, tackling all sorts of really interesting cognitive processes from perception, object recognition, selective attention, language, decision-making, and also just having a load of fun. In the lab, Truett and Greg collaborated with clinicians, with neurosurgeons, to help delineate the boundaries between different brain areas for neurosurgery, and in turn, they were able to explore the functional properties of brain areas using intracranial recordings. And then during this time in the lab, wow, boom, the fMRI tornado hit, and that changed our landscape of our field forever. And I was really lucky to be part of the very first study to use non-invasive, fully non-invasive fMRI to study. In this case, it was working memory. Still something I like to think about. And I have to say, I mean, it's hard to convey this, especially for some of the younger generation, the spirit of innovation, the spirit of transformation during those times were just exhilarating. I mean, it was really palpable that the world was changing and doors were opening really to new possibilities. And since then, the tornado has never really stopped. In neurophysiology, for example, we've gone from studying squiggly lines to event-related potentials, their topographies, to being able to take signals on a trial-by-trial basis and correlate them with behavior. We've opened up the EEG signal instead of this flat broadband signal into its full spectrum using Fourier methods, and increasingly using empirically derived methods which will enable us to see the true shapes of these frequency-specific signals in the brain. We've gone beyond looking at power and amplitude and signals to look at contents that are being coded, to looking at their dynamics. Our equipment is also continuously changing, so since Hans Berger's EEG method, now we can also record the magnetic fields using cryogenic methods, using the new optically pumped magnetometer methods. And with imaging, we've borrowed from X-ray tomography to positron emission tomography to structural and functional MRI, and now with methods of near-infrared spectroscopy, for example, improving increasingly, which will hopefully let us study, both with OPMs and NIRS, humans actually moving around as natural agents. And of course, there are the causal methods with minimally invasive brain stimulation approaches, which can also be combined with other methods. I would say that compared to the ingenuity that we've spent looking at how to measure brain signals, we've lagged a little bit behind in sort of considering how we can measure behavioral signals. So often, we're just quite content to use like single responses and look at people's response times or accuracy, but this too is changing. So increasingly, we can derive interesting measures of the types of errors that people are making, very subtle biases and responses that are influenced by several cognitive factors. And in addition, there are two really interesting trends emerging in the field. So that of using continuous behavioral measures, like I'm looking at eyes, gaze, microsaccades, blinking rates, pupil diameter, and also motion capture, looking at movement trajectories, as well as the refinement of virtual environments and wearable methods that will enable us to run increasingly well-controlled experiments of natural immersive behavior in moving agents. Fascinating to me is how some of the artifacts of the past are now really rich signals. So for example, I remember pre-processing EEG data and going trial by hand and removing every single trial where I saw too much alpha and just ditching all of that data because that was just going to pollute the average of our ERPs. And similarly, until recently, at least in our lab, we would consider eye movements and microsaccades really like a nuisance signal that we just really wish would go away so that we could make sure that our participants were covertly paying attention without any contamination of potential sensory measures. But now we know that there's so much interesting information within the most subtle eye movements, and these actually provide us a window to look even at the focus inside the human mind. Another important trend is how research is beginning to cross the boundaries of the cognitive domains. So, based on common sense, intuition, folk psychology has handed us this well-carved out psychological domains, which we have continued to refine scientifically, first through neuropsychological dissociations and more recently through dissociations with our newer methods. And of course, separating cognitive domains is sensible. It helps reduce complexity, and it helps us be able to dig down into mechanisms. But ultimately, adaptive cognition crosses all boundaries. Indeed, as our science progresses, we may end up with a very different type of mapping. For example, we may end up with a mapping that's much more based on evolutionary adaptations and forces. In my work, I've been particularly drawn to these intersection points, the interactions of cognitive domains, hoping to understand what I consider the hallmark of the human mind, its flexibility, and how it's able to put different contents together in different functions to guide behavior. In our early intracranial work, we discovered some areas with visual and memory-related specializations in the context of word recognition. And at that time, these were, unknown areas that nobody would have conceived that they might have been related to language. And rather than thinking of those as phrenological modules contributing specific, carrying out specific individual functions, we try to emphasize how specializations in perception and associative kinds of functions could join forces with the standard Peary-Sylvian nodes of the classic language circuitry to support word recognition and comprehension. So again, sort of linking these different types of cognitive domains together. And later, when we discovered sort of the functional anatomy of spatial attention network at the individual participant level, initially using PET and then fMRI, we kind of noted in the initial PET studies a very strong relationship between this cognitive process of attention or covert attention and the ocular motor system. Of course, this was a relationship that had been proposed based on theoretical grounds and also observed in some of the animal model studies. Later, we showed how this attention network interacts very strongly with networks of language, motivation, and long-term memory, depending on whether orienting required linguistic, motivational, or mnemonic types of information to guide the orienting act. Over the last few years, we have been working extensively exploring the interactions between attention, memories of different types and timescales, perception, and action. And we've been proposing and refining a framework in which attention, which I define as the functions that anticipate, prioritize, select, and prepare content, draws on memories of different timescales, but also of different types, to focus on relevant information, either from the incoming sensory stream or from our internal memory stores, in order to guide adaptive behavior and prepare action in the light of the possible futures that are about to unfold. So, working across cognitive domains, however, has its challenges. The breadth of the work is really daunting. It's impossible to master the depth and the nuances of all these multiple domains, and our taxonomy is also wanting. So terminology can be confusingly overlapping, but actually not synonymous across different areas. And so there can be a tendency to borrow some oversimplifications from other fields, or just to go with the loudest voices from one domain to the other. So an obvious solution to this is really that we all have to work together, sharing know-how and the depth of our understanding in collaborative teams. And this is why I think venues such as the Cognitive Neuroscience Society are so important to help us promote crosstalk and mutual education, collaborations, also across subfields, but also across species. So our conceptualization of the building blocks of cognition are also beginning to change. So, of course, the first mappings between brain and mind are phrenological in nature. This is the footing of our field. This is not surprising, since a one-to-one mapping between brain areas and cognitive function is the simplest, most intuitive possibility. Indeed, this phrenological intuition is very hard to shake. Most of us think that the field has safely moved away from this way of thinking, but instead, I would argue that it is alive and well in popular culture, on the web, as you see here, but also in our science. So I'm partial to a slightly different way of thinking. And as a graduate student, I was inspired by Marcel Messelam's highly innovative treatment of attention at the time, and actually of cognition more generally. And I sought him out, and through the paths of good fortune, ended up working with him and starting an enduring collaboration and friendship. And Marcel had proposed that initially in the early 80s, but then in this paper that really struck me in 1990, a large-scale network model of attention. And this model stood in sharp contrast to other treatments at the time in which specific brain areas, either as modules or as parts of a circuit were performing specific functions, like disengaging, shifting, or filtering information. In this kind of large-scale network, brain areas do not have dedicated functions. They bring content, and they bring their allegiances together for functions to emerge through interactions in this system. And so the distinction among these areas can become relative. This network provides protective architecture in case of sometimes brain damage, but it also allows for lots of different types of dissociations depending on the site of the breakages, either within the network or between the network and input and output areas. This is not a completely new idea. The network approach has old roots. The first manifestation of this that I know of in the case of human neuroscience is the proposal by Wernicke. And Wernicke presciently suggested that the receptive language area, which he had been studied, and the productive language area that Broca had reported formed a circuit. But furthermore, he talked about how this circuit is connected in a fully rich way with visual, auditory, haptic, and motor areas, which together provided the contents and the semantic elements of language. So over the years, brain imaging has really helped us move away from this idea of single brain areas into networks. It's provided us with tools to detect covariation in activity, to look at how covariations in activity across areas relate to behavior, for example, using functional and effective connectivity, psychophysiological interactions, dynamic causal modeling, resting state analysis, and so forth. And so with these methods, initially with PET and MR, for example, we were able to visualize this network that Marcel had proposed, and now we can do this with increasing granularity and much greater granularity than I'm showing here. But my sense is often still that we tend to still conceive of networks as circuits with little brain areas that are doing their little functions inside of these circuits, without really doing justice to the real networky, interactive aspect of these beasts. And with their various, feed-forward, lateral, reentrant feedback connections that are unfolding in time. So because of my more networky philosophy, I struggle quite a bit with the contemporary, very sophisticated computational neuroimaging approaches that actually use very formal approaches to try to pinpoint exactly what the contribution of different areas are. And an early finding that left a very strong impression on me came from recordings from those visual areas contributing to word recognition with intracranially. And we recorded it from this area while people were following words that appeared centrally either in one color or the other to follow a narrative story. And in this kind of selective attention experiment, we saw, as we've seen before, that these areas have these strong specializations for these kind of perceptual aspects of words, but they really are not modulated at all early on by any of the semantic, contextual, attention functions. But as soon as this information goes into the network and there's like reentrant and the areas start interacting, then the effects are very, very strong, and you can see these attention and contextual modulations. So from these kind of data, it made me think that it's very hard to titrate what is the contribution of a given area without this kind of exquisite temporal resolution. And in fact, I would argue that it's almost hopeless. But yet, this is what we do all the time. I think this is a ubiquitous problem for most of our MRI studies. It's very tricky to separate what's that area contributing initially and what's its contribution once all these network nodes are interacting. So I think that for us to get at these network properties, even within single areas, is going to require methods that have very high temporal resolution, also very high spatial resolution, and are capable of broad sampling of the brain. And this, I would argue, we have lots of amazing methods, but this is still a challenge. We're not quite there yet fully. The data-driven methods we do have, like with imaging, with MR, and then also increasingly with neurophysiology, have enabled us to start really looking at some really interesting aspects of networks. So, for example, they've cemented this insight, observed actually all the way back to Berger, that the brain is not an idle entity that's waiting to react to external stimulation. And even at rest, it's cycling through structured internal states. We can measure these states with as resting state networks, and we can do this with increasing temporal resolution and study their dynamics. And these tools are fantastically powerful and exciting. On the other hand, embracing these networks too rigidly may also lead us astray. Sometimes, in some corners, there's a sense that we are phrenologizing these networks. Should we really be thinking of the brain just having a small set of networks that are interchangeable, that are performing all the functions? My hunch is that this is probably misguided. The resting state networks, of course, are meaningful, and they're showing us meaningful co-activations, but they may be primarily reflecting the sort of brain superhighways, the most well-trodden paths. And it's making it sometimes as hard to see, the bifurcations, the linkage paths, the detours that are probably essential for that flexible traveling through the neural terrain. My other kind of worry or slight gripe is that some of these resting state networks have been given functionally descriptive names a little bit too soon, as if we had already solved what the brain was doing. So in my mind, some of these labels are clearly deficient, some of them are highly misguided, but they stick. They're easy. They're used as explanatory vehicles, and they end up with pervasively misleading many of us in the field. As a side vent, it's not just about labels of networks. I think we've also prematurely labeled brain areas and even psychological phenomena, which have caused great confusion. Of course, we need to be able to communicate, so maybe we have to come up with some kind of weird, interstellar communication neutral system to talk about some areas, networks, and phenomena. But my worries and quibbles aside, I think the measurement, analysis, and the computational tools that we're currently developing have developed and continue to refine to understand these large-scale networks and their dynamics offer some of the most exciting frontiers for our science today. If I ever manage to clear enough time, I look forward to getting serious about learning more about network science, to think better about how some of these may contribute to understanding the principles of brain organization. So slowly, we're also moving from looking for those very simple unitary mechanisms or mechanistic explanations to embracing some more complexity and plurality of processes that achieve adaptive cognition. When I joined the attention field in the late 1980s, the quest was on for the single answers to some really big dichotomy questions. Is the attentional bottleneck early, or is the attentional bottleneck late? Is modulation based on spatial location? Is modulation based on object representation? I believe that nobody still thinks this way. And actually, much of the research in my group, I would say, has gone into championing the plurality, as Freek mentioned, of the attentional control and modulatory processes. And I feel that our work, put together just part of like a big endeavor with lots of other labs, has led to a richer view of attention functions using multiple sources of information to anticipate, prioritize, select, prepare different types of content to guide adaptive behavior. So my very first study in my doctoral thesis, for example, clearly showed this was a study in which people held fixation and viewed words that were presented in bars, we call this bar words, and occasionally monitoring exemplars, in this case of like body parts. And so we could direct attention to one or the other stream or to like both streams at the same time. And with this task, we felt like we kind of nailed this question of early or late selection because we showed that there's very clearly early modulation of visual processing, even to words, which was doubted at that time. But there was also some later modulation of processes that were related to more semantic analysis. And in fact, we had pairs of semantically primed words embedded within the attended and unattended streams, and we showed that the whole degree of the semantic processing, as well as the semantic priming effects, were largely, hugely modulated by focused attention. And at that time, in other groups, people also came to understand that the modulation at these different stages of processing was not just a consequence of modulation happening one place and cascading down, but that there could be dissociable points of modulation along the information processing stream. So this clearly showed to us that modulation can happen in different points in the information processing stream. And then we also wanted to ask about different types of contents that could guide the attentional orienting process. And at that time, and still pervasively now, I think one of the main ideas is that attentional top-down control works by acting on preparing, changing properties that can be mapped onto receptive fields of things. So for example, look at the location or the feature or an object identity, where you could clearly sort of latch on and change receptive field properties in sensory areas. And we wanted to ask if we could also orient attention to things that were not easily mapped onto receptive fields. And we actually just went back and borrowed some old work by Posner and Snyder in the 70s, and also Neely, to ask whether we could look at attentional modulation based on anticipation of semantic categories of words as well as spatial location. So we had this very simple task where cues in one context told you whether the likely relevant lexical item was on the left or right, or in other cases whether it was an animal or a tool. And we found, just like before, for the spatial cues, we had this modulation of visual and semantic levels of processing. We saw these strong accuracy benefits. And we saw similarly huge benefits for semantic cues. So semantic cues also improve your performance. They didn't modulate the visual processing, but they did start modulating later stages of processing, but in a completely different way than spatial cues. So we had a very similar behavioral outcome through completely different pathways in the brain. So this showed that, yes, you could orient attention to non-receptive field-like properties, and that attention can work through many different types of pathways to achieve a behavioral outcome. And our studies later in temporal orienting basically made a very similar kind of point. And then we kind of, went a bit crazy, I would say, and we went sort of looking at attentional modulation, like, actually, let's just go beyond the sensory motor stream altogether. Let's see if we're able to orient our attention in our mind. Can we actually, and we went at the time really against very established dogma that this was something that did not happen. So we were able to demonstrate that people can orient attention similarly in the mind to anticipate, select, prioritize, and prepare contents in working memory to guide memory-based behavior. And this kind of opened up the field of investigation of internal attention. And luckily for us, at the same time, there was parallel studies by Victor Lame's group also showing a very similar phenomenon. So we, and by now others, have done a ton of work on exploring the properties of how we orient attention into our memories, showing that the focus of attention can be directed to locations and objects, but also to feature dimensions, that motor representations can be selected in tandem with sensory ones, that both goal-based and bottom-up capture-based sources of focus can coexist and co-occur, that the focus of attention internally is very flexible and much more flexible and reversible compared to external attention. It can act to enhance information, to prepare it for retrieval, or it can shield information to prevent interference. And it can utilize many different spatial frames. And so this illustrates, again, sort of the richness of this phenomenon. But interestingly, once we started working in this field, really once people believed us, because first nobody believed us, but once people believed us, the first reaction is like, what's the mechanism? It must be protecting the representations, or it must be improving access to these representations. And we have been making the case that actually we should embrace the same plurality that we've learned to recognize in external attention and port that to internal attention, so that we have many different types of sources of attention, external cues, internal states, capture, working on many different types of attributes, objects, features, locations, actions, rules, in order to have many different consequences, enhancing something, improving its accuracy, making it faster, shielding it. So overall, my work has really been trying to champion this idea that let's leave behind the dichotomies or even the trichotomies in attention and really embrace this plurality of attention functions that operate from very early sensation all the way into long-term memory based on various sources of control, and working on very different types of information, some of which are receptive field-based, some of which are not probably coded at the receptive field level, but may require coding at the ensemble or even network level. And one other important point to make is that I think that the very purpose and the kind of task you're in also makes a huge difference. So in almost all of the work that I've done in the attention literature in general, we often use our prior knowledge and our expectations in order to perform a task extremely well. So we exploit that knowledge in order to enhance performance in many different ways. But there may be other contexts. Let's say you are sort of foraging, trying to understand reward structures in the world, where what you know is not the interesting part. The interesting part is learning and is trying to understand what you don't know. And this may lead to really different kind of modulation, like people often talk about in the predictive coding literature, where the emphasis is always on how you dampen the information that you already know, whereas in the attention field, it's always like you use the information you know and you put it to good use. So I think actually conciliating and bringing those literatures together is going to be a fun, but it's a very important challenge rather than us, cross-talking through the waves as if it's all okay. Okay, so I'm still fascinated by this, how we focus attention in our mind and our memories, and this is still a really big area of research in the lab. And I would say that there are still some really big, interesting, and completely open questions. So we are working on a couple of these currently. So we now have our younger field of internal attention happily running alongside the older sister of external attention. But what we really do in the real world is a hybrid. We actually move seamlessly between the internal and the external world to pick up contents to guide our behaviors. So, for example, imagine making a cup of tea. You might see your mug, think about where the tea bag is, and then while you're getting the tea bag, you think about the sugar, you look at the fridge. So we're always in a back and forth, picking up contents in our minds and in the world in order to achieve behavior. So this is something that we're currently sort of busy trying to crack into at the moment and just making our first headways, both with laboratory experiments but also with some immersive virtual reality experiments. And we're also adapting the tools that we've developed for looking at selective attention in working memory to try to understand how we select contents from long-term memory. So of course we know long-term memory retrieval is a selective act. I mean, we have people here who've suggested that attention is an integral part of the memory process. But we're interested in how does that happen? In one context, how do I prioritize one thing over the other? So for example, if I bring up the context of my school in Rio, I may choose to orient my attention to my teachers or to my buddies, and we're sort of trying to develop approaches to start looking at that selective prioritization within long-term memory. So I would say that at the moment, I think that this work is going to bring in even more plurality of mechanisms into the mix, and it is quite possible that one day we will be able to synthesize all of these various complex and multiple sources of control and modulation within sort of one elegant unitary conceptualization. But at least for me, I feel like we're very far from being there yet. So the next shift is from the phenomenological to subjective to the ecological or pragmatic. And of course, the subjective qualities of our mental function are so alluring. They're so baffling. And we, of course, want to understand these. They're representational, their phenomenological, their properties in a scientific way. But wow, that is so hard. I know that there's some brave souls who do this here. But a different approach is to emphasize the sort of ecological utility linked to the evolutionary origins of our psychological processes and investigate how these promote adaptive behavior. So we have been increasingly emphasizing this aspect of cognition in our tasks. And interestingly, even in our work of internal attention and working memory, which one would think is a highly subjective phenomenological kind of process, what we see is really the role of the pragmatic functional aspects coming to bear fruit. So our research on internal attention and working memory revealed a lot of these kind of functional and pragmatic properties of working memory representations. We found, for example, that when we orient attention and working memory, this effect is very transient on the sensory contents. And we've proposed that this is perhaps taking that information and preparing it, putting it in another state to sort of prepare it for output gating for action. And in fact, there is some lovely work by in non-human primates now that's beginning to sort of lend some credence to this kind of idea. And furthermore, sort of in Frake's work, we've been showing that when actions are coupled to working memory representations, these are formatted there and they're ready to go and they're accessed just as quickly as sort of the sensory contents. And of course, the very close relationship which we talked about in the beginning between covert attention and between covert attention and ocular motor control is an obvious link between these mental, psychological functions and the more basic sensory motor building blocks. And this is also true for the internal attention orienting. And furthermore, we've recently shown that when we shift our attention in mind, even between one or the other item, we can read out this internal shift of attention through very small microsaccades that systematically go in the direction of where your attention is focused in mind. And in fact, if we put people in immersive environments, we've shown that this also happens at the head level. And if you have bright and dark items, you can also see pupil changes. So suggesting that even in this highly subjective, mnemonic, internal kind of function, like orienting attention in working memory, you still have these embodied consequences that you can read out. And we'd say that this makes ecological sense. One, because the ocular motor system has a lot of useful computations for orienting attention in general, but also if you think about it, in our tasks, moving eyes and moving heads will never have any ecological validity because stimuli all just disappear. But working memory is often there to bridge over time as we move or as something becomes occluded, and we often do interact with those things immediately after. So those things are useful to prepare for. So our research has been, and our interpretation of other people's research has really led us to cast working memory in a slightly different light than is typical. So I think most of us have tended to consider these kind of representational properties and emphasize the limitations in working memory. And instead, we've been highlighting what an efficient and flexible system this is to prepare us for the most likely scenarios in an adaptive way. So working memory really may be less about this and more about this. Okay, so finally, then, there's time. Grappling with time has always comes late in the development of a scientific field, and in a way it's like a marker of the maturation of the field. And I have to confess that timing does my head in, it keeps me awake at night. We often worry about the spatial binding problem, but think about its temporal dimension for a moment. Senses are coming in, receptive fields have different time courses in our eyes and ears and the chemical senses in our mouth. These things travel through different pathways to get to the brain. They get processed in these distributed systems. They're processed over time with reentrant lateral, forward, backward connections. So it's not just about binding the things together. It's about finding things asynchronous that go together and have to be bound into some kind of sensible thing. But meanwhile, the world is coming in. The world hasn't stopped for you to do all of this. The world is coming in. The world's coming in as full of temporal structure in itself. And we have agency. We move. We move around, we move through the world, and we change our minds. Our goals change, we remember something. So it's crazy. I don't have an answer to that, by the way. But these considerations, they raise really all sorts of really gnarly problems. For example, we believe that synaptic plasticity is really important for laying down long-term memories. Some of us have argued that it's also really important for laying down short-term working memories in highly dynamical systems. Okay, but if a system is in continual flux, what time point does plasticity stamp in? Does it matter? Does it stamp in a bunch of them? Or somehow maybe the brain kind of finds a nice, relaxed, representational moment where things kind of converge and settle down at just the perfect moment for that plasticity to kick in and do its magic later on. So amidst all of this baffling background, we also find that our brain manages not only to make sense of the world, but to extract all sorts of temporal regularities out in the environment in order to anticipate the timing of relevant events. So Jenny Kuhl and I initially showed this with very simple informative cues, initially predictive cues, but we can also do this with instructive cues. And we can see the network of brain areas that are interested in orienting attention in time over and above space. We can look at these anticipatory functions with neurophysiology. And as the field of temporal attention has developed and matured, the work in our group, but also many other groups, has shown that the brain anticipates the timing of events based on temporal associations like the cues, but also rhythms, probabilities of events occurring, sequences, and many other complicated temporal structures. So just to give you a flavor of how some of the properties of temporal attention, our research has shown that temporal predictions, they can amplify, they work through predictions of other features like spatial location, for example, to amplify, enhance the attentional selection based on spatial location. Or, for example, in a serial reaction time task, if you have a sequence of actions, you have some improvement, but on top of that, if you have a sequence of timings, even that's unrelated to that sequence of actions, then you magnify that kind of learning enormously. And we've shown that temporal attention can be formed locally by these local cues or rhythms within a trial, but you can also derive them from long-term memory associations. We've shown that you can use them to extract targets that are occurring amidst lots of other unpredictable, distracting events or either other unpredictable targets, suggesting that it's not just about learning about that one interval, it's something about abstracting that time structure that is regular among all these other things that are going on. We can use temporal expectations to enhance or protect information in working memory, and we can even use it to understand when to pick up relevant information depending on the timing of different tasks if we're performing different multitask situations. So again, all of this emphasizes the plurality of mechanisms. But considering timing and the dynamics is also important beyond just investigating temporal expectations. So as I already mentioned, looking at dynamics can help constrain some of our interpretations about brain organization. So in this case, understanding that maybe this contribution of this area is more perceptual than sort of semantic in nature, for example. And on the other hand, sometimes looking at dynamical signals can actually open up and give us new insights. So for example, in working memory tasks, we've shown, as I've mentioned a couple of times, that we can actually select sensory and motor information in tandem, in parallel, at the same time. If we have tasks that we orthogonally control which hand or which location items have to be drawn from and which hands you have to respond to, you might imagine that you would first select the sensory content and then decide what to do, but actually that's not the case. If you measure both of those, you can see that if everything's encoded in working memory, both of those signals are ready to go at the same time. And similarly, using those artifacts of the microsaccades and now putting them to using them as signals, we've been able to show that, for example, you can see the action of both voluntary goal-based orienting of attention and working memory and that bottom-up capture, for example, based on the match of a color of the cue. And you can see that both of these effects also can happen in tandem at the same time, and in cases sometimes pulling against each other or reinforcing each other. So these gives us new ways of thinking about things which we wouldn't have been able to see before. But most importantly, really, is that we live in flux. We live in the flux of time. Our cognitive system operates through time, picking up all these and utilizing temporal structure in the world. And temporal structures, they frame cognition also across various time scales. So in our studies, we've kind of emphasized these very short interval time scales, like within a trial or within an act, within a timing of an event to occur. But of course, this is embedded. Timing also plays a role in sort of how we parse out the continuous stream of our experience over the day into events, like picking up event structures, which are absolutely fundamental for us to link our memories together and also plan and imagine for the future. And of course, all of this happens through our lifespan, with all the changes that brings about, and ultimately we were all carved by the slower times of evolution. So in my mind, like how these various timescales end up mutually impacting one another is something that I think is really fascinating and that I hope to think a lot more about going forward. So I think embracing timing and dynamics is going to be essential for advancing our field, understanding of the brain, computations, and also our psychological functions. I don't think this is going to be easy. And I would say that even nowadays, most sophisticated computational models don't fully embrace, for example, timing. They kind of kludge timing. They work by iterations, and they kludge timing by spatializing time. But in neuroscience, we see a lot of really interesting temporal motifs. And at these very short time scales, for example, we see ramping of neuronal activity. We see oscillatory patterns. We see bursts. We see different states alternating at certain time scales. We see the dynamics. So I think it would be amazing if we could start thinking together across all these intellectual structures here and understanding how these motifs are distributed in the brain, whether some of them are different perspectives of the same thing, of the same phenomena, whether some of them are different phenomena that can coexist, whether some of them are simply incompatible or wrong or an artifact of some of our measurements. But I think it's time that we start getting a much better traction on some of these problems. Okay, so now that we have galloped through these 6 vignettes together, where does this leave us? Well, I'd say still full of wonder. I've said this before, whenever the occasion is right, but I believe that cognitive neuroscience is young. We're still catching up with the physical and life sciences. We started a bit late. There was a lot of holding back, and people didn't believe that this was a science that should happen at all. And we're tackling the hardest of problems. I think many of our ideas are still rooted in folk psychology and intuition, but we have amazing methods to measure and quantify brain activity, psychological functions, and behavior. I would say this places us somewhere early in our scientific revolution as a kind of a Newtonian phase. And my sense is that things are going to get really weird, much stranger, before we start having any adequate model of the human mind. But for now, we can enjoy being part of this intensive, mesmerizing scientific transformation and keep our minds wide open for the turning points to come. So I'd like to end by thanking all the research fellows and students. I've tried to capture most of those graduate students and research fellows who've been through the lab, who brought their ideas and talents, aspirations, fears, tools, experiences that make up our lab and all its scientific offerings. But also to thank my friends and colleagues for sharing their wisdom and knowledge and values and humor. And thank Luciano, my lovely husband, who brings me meaning and happiness to my life on a daily basis. And to thank you for spending this very special moment for me. Thank you.